Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Ethos Online. Again, this is a space where we can be, belong, and become the very best version of ourselves. So, again, wherever you're joining us, if you are in California, Idaho, Florida, Michigan, Minnesota, wherever it is you're joining us, we just want to say we're so grateful that you continue journeying with us through this amazing compilation of pieces called the Bible. And so, this is kind of our tradition. This is what we do. We continually ask deeper questions of the Bible. And so we don't just leave it at a surface level. We always go a little deeper. And so whenever we approach something like the Bible, an ancient piece of literature, what we'll do is we'll ask important questions, right? Like, who wrote it? Who was the writing intended for? When was this written? Right? Why might this have been written at the time that it was? All of these, was it a reaction? Was it not? Was it poetry? Was it prose? Was it mythic language? What was it used for? What kind of literature? All of those things, we consider that when we approach the piece. And so at Ethos, that's what we continue to do. And it takes time, it takes energy. And so we would ask that you continue considering walking with us financially, as well as continuing to promote these videos, share these videos. Anytime a video connects with you, if you think, oh, that's super interesting, I never thought about that before, share these videos. We would love for people to continue to pick these up and find deeper appreciation for this book we call the Bible. And so we are continuing to move through the book, the book Genesis, right? In what we call the Old Testament. If we were Jewish, we would say Torah, right? So Genesis, oftentimes considered the book of origins, right? But we understand Genesis, again, is not a history book. It's not written to give detailed, perfect dates of exactly when this happened, when someone died, how old they were, all of these different elements. That was never the point. Again, Genesis is a written response to the fear of assimilation. Because Israel at this moment in time, 587 BC, they were captives in Babylon, right? They had been taken captive by this huge empire, and they were forced to assimilate. And so if you're Babylon, you're saying, take our gods now, right? Take our values. You will participate in our traditions. You will become Babylonian. And 99.9% of the tribes did this, except for one that we know of for sure during this era, and they were called Israelites, right? And so in the middle of all of this, they were looking around and they were saying, how do we hold on to our traditions, our stories, our values? How do we stay Hebrew, right? And so what they did is they combined all the stories, all the metaphor, all of the epic tales, they put it all into a piece called Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And this was the gift that they would pass down to the future generations so that they wouldn't forget their story. And so Torah is a written response to the fears of assimilation. And so every time we read this, right? Every time we read Torah, anytime we read the Bible, actually, consider that this is a response in order for this group of people to hold on to the rich tradition of Judaism. And so anytime this book is opened, right? Anytime the scrolls were pulled out, anytime the rabbi would sit down on the stool, much like I'm doing, sit down with his people, he would share different jewels about the beauty of what this was, what it meant to be a Jew, right? What it meant to be a human and live fully here and now. That's what they would do. And so every time Torah, the scrolls are brought out, it's a celebration. They approached it as something that was holy, reverent. It's beautiful. And so again, it's a compilation of poetry, songs, mythology, prophetic musings, warnings from kings. Like, hey, we've seen this before, right? We've seen what this does. Maybe let's not go down that direction this time, right? It's like us today. When we look back at history, there's certain things we know we probably shouldn't do. Right? We have a rich tradition of slavery all throughout civilization. Right? 200 years ago, if you had said slavery was immoral, it was wrong, people would have been scratching their head just 200 plus years ago. Right? But we've understood there's a growing ethic, a change, a shift. And so slavery we know to be something that's immoral, wrong. Even though 200 years after the Western world decided slavery was wrong, it would still be, Europeans were still being sold, in Muslim worlds. But it took time, it took energy. And now when we look back, we realize slavery, wrong. We shouldn't be doing that, right? And so today we continue growing, but we have a rich history to look back on. And so for the Israelites, they were looking back on their story and they're saying, what did we learn from this? They weren't changing their story to suit their present. No, they were looking back saying, what did we learn? What do we do differently now? Right? What did our ancestors tell us through their stories, their poetry, their warnings, so that we might live better today? That is what the beauty of Torah was. And so again, Torah is a complete narrative of Israel miniaturized through its telling. So every time you read about a messianic character, anytime you think, oh, that's an interesting name that means this or this, understand there's a lot of metaphorical meaning there, right? And oftentimes it's associated with who Israel is and who they aren't. And so Abraham, right, the father of Israel, right, literally the founder, this is what that word meant. The founder of Israel steps away from the rigid tradition of polytheism and different ways of worship, steps away from it and begins living differently, right? Worshiping monotheistically, all these different things. This is what Abraham will do. And so today we're going to look at Genesis 19. We're going to finish this chapter next time around, but we're going to step into kind of the middle of Genesis 19, 14 through 26. And so to start with, understanding this section, it's really important to know this is basically a retelling of the Exodus story. And this story will be retold over and over again through Daniel the lion's den. We'll understand it in a bigger way through Jesus, right? Through Joseph, through Moses. We're going to hear this story retold over and over again. But this is basically another retelling of Exodus, right? They're exiting Egypt. Right? And they have to do it really quickly before the wrath of God takes down this empire, right? Before the empire falls. This idea, this storyboard, this plot, if you will, this will be observed over and over again in their story. Because this was a tribal group who continued to be swallowed up by every large empire that came onto the scene. And so let's read together. Genesis 19, 14 through 26. So Lot went forth and spoke to his son-in-law, the suitors of his daughters. And he said, arise, go forth from the place, for the Lord is destroying the city. But he seemed like a comedian in the eyes of his sons-in-law. So again, if you remember the context here, the angels have come. They've said that everything's going to fall apart. It's going to be destroyed. Get out of here. So Lot now, he's running here to his sons-in-laws and his daughters and saying, this thing's about to blow, right? Let's get out. 15. And as the dawn rose, and the angels pressed Lot, saying, get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you perish because of the iniquity of the city. But he tarried, and the men took hold of his hand and his wife's hand and the hand of his 2 daughters out of the Lord's pity for him. So notice that they have to force Lot, right? They grab him. They have to pull him away, right? And it all goes back to this respect for Abraham. Right? They have to grab Lot forcibly. They have to grab his hand and kind of nudge him along, pull him along, right? And they took him out and placed him outside the city. And it came to pass when they took them outside that he said, flee for your life. Do not look behind you. Do not stand in the entire plain. Flee to the mountain lest you perish. And Lot said to them, please do not, O Lord. Behold, now your servants have found favor in your eyes, and as you increase your kindness, which you have done with me to sustain my soul, but I cannot flee to the mountains, lest the evil overtake me and I die. So he's kind of bargaining now, right? There's this theme of bargaining with the divine. Behold, now this city is near to flee there, and it is small. Let me please flee there. Is it not too small? And my soul will survive. And he said to him, behold, I have favored you also, and as regards this matter, that I will not overturn the city that you have mentioned. Hasten, flee there, for I will not be able to do anything until you arrive there. Therefore he named the city Zoar. So again, understand this. Lot says, I don't know if I can make it to the mountains, right? I don't know if I'm fast enough, right? Let me just go over to that city that's nearby, Zoar, right? Let me run to that city, this close by city. The sun came out upon the earth, and Lot came to Zoar. And the Lord caused the rain down upon Sodom and Gomorrah, brimstone and fire, and the Lord from heaven. And he turned over these cities and the entire plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and the vegetation of the ground. And his wife looked from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. So that's where we'll stop today. She becomes a pillar of salt. Many of us have heard this story. We've seen it on the felt board, right? But deep inside this short segment, there's something really powerful, especially if you're an Israelite. And so I want to kind of tease that out. But before we do, let's go verse by verse. There's some really cool gems here I want to share with you. Look at this first one. He goes to his sons-in-law and he tells them the city's going to burn, right? Like we got to get out of here. And what do the sons respond with? Notice this. It says, but he seemed like a comedian in the eyes of the son-in-law. Because here's the thing. Sometimes we speak truth, right? The others just aren't able to pick up yet. Sometimes we share something, we think something, and it doesn't seem familiar yet to people, right? We'll give a warning, right? Sometimes we get so caught up in a common narrative or a story or whatever it is that anything else we kind of turn a blind eye to. Well, that can't be true, right? These sons, they're unwilling to hear the truth. They're unwilling to hear it. They're unable to see that Sodom is about to fall, right? They have been so accustomed to what goes on in Sodom that they've actually become numb to the evil effects of it, right? They've just gotten used to being a sodomite. They've gotten used to Sodom and Gomorrah, the destruction, the lies. It's just become commonplace. And anyone that questions this seems crazy. A friend of mine, he said, he told me this joke. He said, what's the difference between conspiracy and truth? And I said, I don't know. He said 8 months. Which I thought was hilarious. Many times I've found, especially in the last couple of years, someone will bring something crazy that I think is crazy. Give it time, give it texture. Sometimes, every once in a while, give it 8 months, and it came from Wuhan lab, right? Like interesting things will come up. Sometimes truth. Sometimes you gotta wait a few minutes, right? Sometimes you gotta sit on it. Other times, that is absolutely crazy. But we have to decipher. We have to take time. We have to think things through. Use our gray matter, right? Lot goes there. He says, "Look, you've gotten really used to Sodom and Gomorrah, but this thing's about to fall." But they've become so used to it, it's become commonplace. And that's why, again, I think one of the warnings here for me is we should be asking questions of every narrative that comes up. We should be asking deeper questions. The fact that we allow these comedians, right? These comedy stars, these celebrities to become our like navigating force of truth is kind of scary today. Right? We have these deeper questions, these deeper truths. And I think so often the absolutely wrong people are the ones that are beginning to be like, hey, I'm the expert, right? We should be the ones asking questions of these movements, of these narratives, of these different ideas that are all around us. If we are not asking critically thinking questions, we will constantly fall to every weird, odd, new idea or old idea. Or we'll just get accustomed to things that are really destructive. We have to be asking questions now more than ever of everything we see, right? And so this is Sodom and Gomorrah. No one's asking deeper questions. Everyone's just getting used to it, and they've fallen asleep. These suitors have completely fallen asleep to the reality around them. And it's sad. The story continues. 15, get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you perish because of the iniquity of the city. The idea here is God is not literally, at least this is one perspective, right? Most Jewish people, most Hebrew rabbis didn't believe that God literally came down and burned the whole thing up. That wasn't the dominating narrative, the dominating interpretation of this. The idea here is that empires, the consequences of hurting people, the consequences of removing freedom, the consequences of creating slaves, oppressing people, this idea, the consequences will fall, right? The empire will not last forever. And the consequences of the violence, of the hate, of the anger, of the oppression, the consequences will fall. And so most interpretations are not that God literally does this, it's this. God literally does this. Steps back, allows the consequences of Babylon, of Sodom and Gomorrah, right, to fall, allows them to fall. And where should we be in the middle of this? Well, let's watch what Lot and his family does. We'll continue. It says this in 17. There are three things that the angel asks of them. And here's what I hope you pick up in 17. And it came to pass when they took them outside, he said to them, notice this first, flee for your life. Number one, flee for your life. Why flee? I want you to think about this. Why flee if God's like taking care of you, right? Why flee? Why book it out of there? Like you could even say, okay, God, like snap your magic finger, whatever it is. Why are you telling me to flee? Why are you telling me to get out so quickly, right? It's in your time, right? If you're doing this thing, if the consequences are going to fall and you're going to save me, what's the idea here? Well, the idea here is deeply connected to Egypt, right? The Exodus. The idea here is about possessions. So follow me here. This is what Rabbi Rashi says about this, one of the most famous of rabbis of the Jewish tradition. He says this, Lot and his family are asked to flee, to leave without hesitation. This is the great test of the Jew. In our leaving beastly empire, will we hold to material things or leave them behind? Right? How important are possessions to you? Right? Do you possess things or do they possess you? Right? So in the middle of the captivity, in the middle of them being in Babylon, when it's time to leave, did you acquire a bunch of status, a bunch of wealth, a bunch of things? Is it so important to you that when you're given the opportunity to be free, will you still hold on to it? Right? Will that keep you from being free? Will you choose those possessions, those things, that status, that virtue signal, whatever the thing is? Will you hold on to that instead of walking in freedom when you get the chance? Right? So heavy. Will you be able to get up and leave? Or will you be so stuck to Babylon that you can't leave? Will you have assimilated so well in something you know to be really destructive that it's really difficult now because you've put down so many roots in a really destructive place? That is the deeper question. That's the deeper idea of fleeing here. You cannot take your time here. You got to step out now. You have to be ready now. It's beautiful. Next one, notice this. Do not look behind you. Don't look behind you. I've always wondered this, like, what's the big deal? Like, she looks behind her, she becomes salt. That seems like such an arbitrary thing that God would be mad at her that, oh, well, now you become salt, right? But again, there's something deeper. This is Exodus language we're talking about here. This message is for Israel in the middle of Babylonian captivity. And so when you have the opportunity to step into freedom, to leave Babylon, the question is, of course, are you going to look back? Are you going to get so assimilated, so caught up in a destructive thing that you're going to miss it? It's like, think about the woman who's gotten so used to the abusive husband, right? So used to it that when she finally leaves, she's in the car going away, she has to say, you know what, stop, I got to go back. I'm just used to it. Right? I know the abuse is wrong. I know it's oppressive. I know it's wrong. I know he's going to hit me again, but I'm just kind of used to it. And you look back and you find yourself longing a relationship that was destructive. That's the idea here. When it's time to leave, will you have assimilated as so well that you won't be able to break from the evils of Babylon, right? Will it have a hold of you? Don't get too comfortable, Israel, in Babylon. Don't get so comfortable that you find yourself longing for it again. That's the idea here. Don't look back. Don't long for the thing that was destructive, abusive, bad for you, right? Bad for your soul. Don't look back. That's the idea. And the third one was this. And this one I think is one of the most beautiful of all. It says this: do not stand in the entire plain. Flee to the mountain. What's the deal with the plain, the mountain? The idea here, this is cool. The mountain, this is where big things happen, right? If you're an Israelite, you know your stories, the big moments, they happen on the mountaintops, don't they? Yeah, they happen on the mountaintops. This is where Moses is going to receive the law. Jesus is on the mountaintop, shares the law. Messianic characters do great things on the mountaintops, right? The mountaintop is where we meet the divine, where we see the divine face to face, which means the plain is where we lose sight of God. The plain is where we miss it. Right? So the mountaintop experience is where we fight, we push ourselves, right? We test our endurance until we get to the top, until we reach that summit. And so the plain is where we settle. If you're an Israelite, you make the connection. The plains is where you settle, you sit, you become stagnant. And so Israel is called here, you need to rise, right? This journey is not going to be easy. It's not going to be a simple one. Right? You're going to be tested. There's 40 days, 40 nights, 40 years, right? The idea here, it's a time of change and shift and movement. You're going to learn and unlearn certain things. It's going to be a mountaintop experience. But to get to the mountaintop, you've got to fight for it, right? You've got to work at it. You've got to climb. And when you get to the top, it's worth it because you see God face to face. But if you stay on the plain, if you choose to stay in the middle, you miss the whole thing entirely, right? You only get halfway, and halfway is kind of worthless, isn't it? Yeah. The idea here is move forward. Don't lose sight of the divine. Don't lose sight of the journey. So good. Continues. Verse 18 and 19. And Lot said to him, please do not, O Lord, right? He's fighting it. Behold now, your servant has found favor in you, in your eyes, and you have increased your kindness, which you have done with me to sustain my soul. But I cannot flee to the mountain, lest the evil overtake me. Again, this is where the interesting element of the story goes, right? God calls Lot and his family. He says, rise, right? Meet me on the mountaintop. Rise. And yet Lot, his response, which I think is it's so easy for so many of us to do, right? In our own journeys. Lot's response is connected so deeply with Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, I want to stay on the plains. I don't want to dig deep into the surface. I don't want to ask questions of this narrative, right? I want to just stay on the surface, right? I want to dig my head in the sand. I want to just stay where it's safe, it's comfortable, right? I don't want to seek anything deeper. I just want to stay safe and sound. I'll follow the common idea here of Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm not going to push any further. This, again, was such an absolute affront to what it meant to be an Israelite. An Israelite was someone who pushed, shifted, changed, moved up the mountain. It was the Abraham story. But Lot says, no, I'm fine on the plain. I'm fine on the plain. Behold now, this city is near to flee there. And it is small. Let me please flee there. Is it not small? And my soul will survive. Notice that, survive, not thrive, survive. That's Lot's perspective. I want to survive. Abraham says, I want to thrive. Two very different perspectives for Israel, right? And he said to him, behold, I have favored you also in regards to this matter, and I will not overthrow the city which you have mentioned. Hasten, flee there, for I will not be able to do anything until you arrive there. Therefore, he named the city Zor. So again, sometimes we don't always get there, do we? And I know I sound a bit judgmental talking about the plains. The truth is sometimes this happens to us, doesn't it? Sometimes we get a little close to the things, a little too close to the things we know we probably need to leave behind. Sometimes those things, we've gotten so used to them that leaving them behind is just really difficult. And so when that happens, yes, let's show ourselves some grace, but let's not stay there too long, right? Let's not stay there too long. We'll continue. And the sun came upon the earth, and Lot came to Zoar. And the Lord caused the rain down upon Sodom and Gomorrah, brimstone and fire from the Lord and from heaven. And he turned over these cities and the entire plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities and the vegetation of the ground. And his wife looked from behind him. She looked back and became a pillar of salt. So what happens, right, when we choose not to step fully into the new life? Right? What happens when we hold on too long to the things we know are destructive? We bury our heads in the sand, protesting everything's just fine, right? It's just fine. And what happens? Well, we become salt, right? We become a bit worthless, right? And this idea here of salt, she again becomes this thing that's lifeless, right? This thing that's just, she becomes this lifeless statue, this reminder that when we stop forward motion, we stop altogether. Our very soul dries up. Here's a quote that I found really fascinating to kind of sum up what we discussed. Lot's wife reminds us that when we choose to stay in Sodom, we become lifeless salt blown to and fro in the wind. For Israel in this moment, this section of the story, this direct reference to the story of Egypt, fleeing Babylon, fleeing Rome, right? That same story, that same narrative. The reminder is don't get too comfortable in Babylon. Don't get too comfortable with the things you know are destructive. Don't get too comfortable. Don't assimilate too much in the thing you know is not forever. It's not the place you're going to stay. Don't get too comfortable there. Know that the next thing, the next big thing, the next movement, the moment of freedom is coming. Don't get too comfortable in the things that bring brokenness, destruction, despair. This is only a moment of pause for you, right? The mountaintop is calling. That's beautiful. And so how do we take it home? I started thinking about this. The idea here really of this section is avoid assimilation, Israel. And so I started thinking about my own life. When are there moments in time where I feel like, I don't want to assimilate to this thing. I don't want to buy into this thing that I know is destructive. And so what do I do, right? How do I avoid going down that road, much like Israel was, getting too comfortable in Babylon? One of the things I thought for myself was I need to continue to learn to embrace me. Right? Your personality, your quirks, your likes, your dislikes, your hobbies, keep those things alive and vibrant. Remind yourself when you're in the middle of the thing that's kind of removing your identity, when you're in the middle of following a tradition that you know like doesn't really work anymore, remind yourself this is who I am, and who I am, it doesn't really fit that thing. And what am I really going to continue buying into that thing that doesn't fit anymore? Ask yourself that question. Remember who you are, right? I'm a child of God. I'm creative. I'm someone who uses my critical thinking, my gray matter, right? Does this thing really fit with who I am? Number 2, invest yourself and in your passions. Invest in yourself and your passions. I think for Israel, this is really important too. It's important utilizing your resources. Pour into your life. Right? Continue building yourself up. When you're in the middle of Babylon, there's only a couple things you can do, right? When you're in the middle of the brokenness, the despair, when you're in the beastly empire, you can build up, you can work on self, right? And again, what does that mean? Education, health, passions, whatever the thing is. When you're at the job that just sucks, right? When you're working at the job, but there's nothing else for you yet, then continue building on you, who you are, right? Take time to start working out, right? Reading the self-help books. Do those things until the new opportunity comes. And when it does, you'll be ready. And you'll be a better person when it comes, right? What a brilliant idea here. Israel, when it's time to flee Babylon, may you have worked on yourself so much that when you flee, you're actually a better person because of it. So good, right? Number 3, set up boundaries quickly. Remember, boundaries aren't walls, right? Boundaries aren't walls, but it's always a smart idea to set up healthy boundaries right out the gate. So Babylon is this, I am not this. I believe in this, not this, right? I will always be someone who believes in freedom, right? For me personally, I can't imagine censoring like anyone. Like I'm directly against certain things. And so understanding that about myself, when there are certain movements that are shifting and changing, certain definitions moving and changing, shifting, I know who I am. I know what I believe. And I've set up certain boundaries. I will not go this far. These are certain values and ethics that I have that I just cannot shift. These are the boundaries I have, and I will hold to those. And when you have that same perspective, you will value the decisions you made, right? And they'll be based on something. It won't be just shifting sand constantly. You'll know the ethics and the values, the morals you have, and they might grow bigger, right? But you at least have set something so that you know I'm not going to step away from those things. Yeah, so good. Another one, hold on to logical thinking, please. Right? I think in classrooms, churches, workplaces, I think we need to continue helping people understand we have to ask questions of things. Take time, think about your life, figure out what's most important to you, what hills you're going to die on, right? Critically think through all of it. If this happens, then what about this? And if this is true to this, then what about this? Ask the deeper questions, right? And when you do, oftentimes you'll find, oh, I fit in really well with this idea. Or maybe, you know what, deep at the heart of it, I don't think this fits me. But you'll know because you've thought it through. You don't just buy it because, Leno says it, or whoever the comedian is of that time, Oliver or Fox News, whatever the comedic thing is you're watching, whatever it is, you've thought it through. Yeah. And then lastly, get in touch with your past. I think when we understand our past, when we understand the people, places, traditions that we've come from, I think then we can understand and we can say, this I still value. And I'll always hold community close, even though the idea of community shifted, right? Whatever those values are, you can hold close to those in the middle of Babylon or in the middle of whatever the thing is you're experiencing. You're here for that short time, right? Freedom's coming, if that's the place you're in. If you're in the middle of Babylonian exile, whatever that is, whether it's a job, a relationship, just a rut in life, right? Freedom's coming. Will you be prepared to grab a hold of it and walk in it when it does? That's the question for Israel, and I think it's a great question for us. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. As always, consider going to ethos-church.org/donate. Give that tax-deductible donation. Continue journeying with us. We're about to begin really moving, trying to get more of the Ethos living rooms going again, trying to get more people involved in different ways, always having conversations with the people over so many things, whether it's who were the giants in Genesis to what really is the Easter story about, right? These kind of questions are so fun when you're talking about it in groups. And as always, please hit that subscribe button, share these videos. Everyone, take care. And next week, we will finish off this chapter together. Really kind of an interesting one. Take care. We'll see you next week. Bye.